In the darkest corners of human psychology lies a truth so uncomfortable that most choose to ignore it entirely. Fear is not merely an emotion, it is the master key to the human soul, the invisible chain that binds civilizations, and the secret weapon of every tyrant who has ever walked the earth. To understand fear is to understand power itself, and to master fear is to become untouchable by the manipulations of others. The story begins not in boardrooms or battlefields, but in the primitive recesses of our minds where ancient survival mechanisms still govern modern behavior. Every day, millions of people surrender their autonomy, their dreams, and their very essence to the dark architects of control, not because they must, but because they fear what might happen if they don't. This is the psychology of power in its rawest form, and those who understand it hold the keys to influence that most cannot even perceive. Marcus sat in the sterile conference room, watching his colleagues nod in unison as their manager outlined another round of impossible deadlines. He could see the fear in their eyes, the same fear that had kept him compliant for years. Fear of losing the job, fear of being singled out, fear of the unknown. But something had shifted in Marcus over the past months. He had begun to see the invisible architecture of control that surrounded him. And more importantly, he had started to dismantle the weak parts of himself that made such control possible. The revelation had come gradually, like dawn breaking over a landscape he thought he knew. He realized that every institution, every relationship, every social structure operated on the same fundamental principle. Those who could instill fear controlled those who lived in it. But the most profound discovery was that the fear others used against him was nothing compared to the fear he harbored about his own limitations, his own weakness, his own mortality. The external controllers were merely exploiting internal vulnerabilities that he had the power to eliminate. Part 1. The architecture of fear. Fear operates on multiple levels simultaneously, each more sophisticated than the last. At its most basic level, it triggers the amygdala's fight-or-flight response, flooding the system with stress hormones that cloud judgment and narrow perception. But this biological reaction is just the foundation upon which more complex psychological structures are built. The true masters of fear understand that lasting control comes not from triggering immediate panic, but from creating chronic, low-level anxiety that becomes so normalized it feels like reality itself. The corporate environment where Marcus worked exemplified this principle perfectly. No one explicitly threatened employees, yet everyone lived in a constant state of unease. Layoffs were always rumored, but never confirmed. Performance metrics shifted without warning. Success was celebrated briefly, then immediately overshadowed by higher expectations. The message was clear without ever being spoken. Your security depends entirely on our approval, and our approval is never guaranteed. This systematic uncertainty served a purpose far beyond simple employee management. It created a workforce that was simultaneously grateful for their position and terrified of losing it, making them willing to sacrifice increasing amounts of their lives, their values, and their autonomy in exchange for the illusion of stability. The fear wasn't directed at any specific threat, but at the vast unknown of what life might become without the protective umbrella of the organization. But Marcus had begun to recognize that this protective umbrella was itself an illusion. The company offered no real security. It could disappear overnight through mergers, market shifts, or economic downturns. The safety it promised was conditional, temporary, and ultimately fictitious. Yet people clung to it with desperate intensity because the alternative required confronting the fundamental uncertainty of existence itself. The psychology of institutional control relies on this displacement of existential anxiety onto manageable immediate concerns. Rather than grappling with the reality that life is inherently uncertain and that security is always temporary, people focus their fears on specific, seemingly controllable elements: job performance, social approval, financial status. This redirection makes them vulnerable to anyone who claims to offer protection from these manufactured threats. Understanding this mechanism, Marcus began to observe how it manifested in every area of life. Political systems operated on the promise to protect citizens from threats, real and imagined, foreign and domestic, present and future. Religious institutions offered salvation from eternal punishment in exchange for compliance with earthly authority. Educational systems created artificial scarcity through grading and competition, making students desperate to earn approval that would supposedly guarantee future success. The pattern was always the same: create or amplify a sense of threat, position yourself as the solution to that threat, then demand increasing levels of submission in exchange for protection. The more sophisticated the system, the more abstract the threats became. until people found themselves surrendering fundamental freedoms to avoid consequences they couldn't clearly define but deeply feared. Marcus remembered his childhood, when his parents had used similar tactics without conscious awareness. If you don't study hard, you'll never get into a good college. If you don't get into a good college, you'll never find a decent job. If you don't find a decent job, you'll never be able to support a family. Each conditional threat created anxiety about a future he couldn't control, making him desperate to comply with present demands that promised to mitigate those future risks. But the promises were always hollow. Getting good grades didn't guarantee college admission. College graduation didn't guarantee employment. Employment didn't guarantee security or fulfillment. Each milestone revealed that the next level of control was waiting, armed with new threats and new promises. The carrot remained perpetually out of reach while the stick grew increasingly sophisticated. The breakthrough came when Marcus realized that the entire system depended on his participation in his own subjugation. Every threat required his internal collaboration to be effective. If he didn't fear unemployment, the threat of firing became meaningless. If he didn't crave social approval, the threat of ostracism lost its power. If he didn't believe that his current comfort could be permanently maintained, the threat of change became an opportunity rather than a crisis. This recognition led to a fundamental shift in perspective. Instead of asking, "How can I protect myself from these threats?" he began asking, "Why do I believe these threats have power over me?" The answer was always the same, because he had unconsciously agreed that certain conditions were necessary for his well-being, happiness, or survival. But these conditions were largely arbitrary, culturally constructed, and subject to his conscious revision. The weak self that made him controllable was not his body, his circumstances, or even his emotions. It was the collection of assumptions, beliefs, and attachments that made him dependent on external validation and protection. Every fear that others could exploit existed only because he had internalized the belief that he needed something outside himself to be complete, safe, or worthy. As this understanding deepened, Marcus began to notice how differently he responded to situations that had previously triggered anxiety and compliance. When his manager made unreasonable demands backed by implicit threats, Marcus felt curiosity rather than fear. What was this person trying to accomplish? What fear were they operating from? How had the system programmed them to believe that control over others was necessary for their own security? The shift was subtle but profound. Instead of being a participant in the drama of control, he became an observer of it. The threats that had once seemed urgent and personal revealed themselves as generic psychological tools that would work on anyone who accepted their underlying premises. But he no longer accepted those premises, which meant the tools could find no purchase in his psyche. This didn't make him rebellious or antagonistic, quite the opposite. Free from the need to defend against threats he no longer believed in, he could respond to situations with clarity and creativity rather than fear and reactivity. He could engage with systems of control without being controlled by them, like a fish that swims in water without being dissolved by it. The transformation wasn't complete or permanent. Old patterns of fear-based thinking would resurface, especially during times of stress or uncertainty. But each time they appeared, Marcus recognized them more quickly and challenged them more effectively. The weak self that had once dominated his decision-making was being systematically dismantled and replaced with something far more resilient and autonomous. Part 2. The mechanics of mental slavery. The second level of fear-based control operates through the creation of identity dependencies that make freedom feel like self-destruction. This is where the psychology becomes truly sinister, because the chains are forged not by external force but by internal identification with roles, statuses, and narratives that require constant validation to maintain. Marcus's awakening deepened as he recognized how his sense of self had become entangled with his position in various hierarchical structures. He wasn't just Marcus. He was Marcus the marketing director, Marcus the homeowner, Marcus the college graduate, Marcus the responsible citizen. Each identity carried with it a set of expectations, obligations, and vulnerabilities that could be exploited by anyone who threatened to withdraw recognition of that identity. The genius of this system lay in its ability to make people complicit in their own control. No external force was required to maintain compliance once individuals had internalized the belief that their worth, their safety, and their very existence depended on maintaining their position within the system. The threat of losing one's role became indistinguishable from the threat of losing oneself. This identification process began early and operated through every social institution. Children learned that they were good or bad based on their compliance with authority figures. Adolescents discovered that their social worth fluctuated based on their ability to conform to peer expectations while achieving institutional markers of success. Adults found their sense of purpose and identity increasingly tied to their professional roles, their relationship status, their financial position, and their social standing. Each identity layer created new vulnerabilities. The successful professional feared becoming unemployed not just because of economic consequences, but because unemployment threatened the very core of who they believed themselves to be. The devoted parent feared their children's independence not just because of emotional attachment, but because their identity as someone who is needed was at stake. The respected community member feared social disapproval not just because of practical inconvenience, but because their self-concept depended on maintaining that respect. Marcus began experimenting with consciously loosening these identity attachments. What would happen if he stopped defining himself by his job title? What if his worth wasn't determined by his salary, his possessions, or other people's opinions of his choices? Initially, this exploration felt terrifying, like standing at the edge of an abyss where his familiar self might simply disappear. But as he continued the practice, something unexpected emerged. Beneath the layers of constructed identity was something much more stable and unassailable. This awareness could observe the various identities he had adopted without being limited by them. It could engage with social roles without mistaking them for ultimate reality. The discovery was simultaneously liberating and disorienting. If his sense of self wasn't dependent on his job, his relationships, or his achievements, then the threats that had once seemed existential became merely inconvenient. Losing his position might require practical adjustments, but it couldn't touch the essence of who he actually was. Disapproval from others might be unpleasant, but it couldn't diminish his fundamental worth or capability. This detachment from identity-based fears created an interesting paradox. The less he needed external validation, the more authentic and effective he became in his various roles. Without the desperate energy of someone trying to prove or protect his worth, he could focus entirely on the actual requirements of any situation. His performance improved precisely because it was no longer motivated by fear of failure or need for approval. Other people began to notice the change, though they couldn't always articulate what was different about him. There was a quality of presence and self-possession that made him simultaneously more approachable and more mysterious. He seemed less concerned with impression management and more interested in genuine connection and effective action. But the shift also revealed how thoroughly the psychology of control had infected even his closest relationships. Friends and family members had unconsciously relied on his predictable fears and desires to maintain their own sense of stability and control. When he stopped responding to familiar triggers, guilt, obligation, the need for approval, some relationships became strained or superficial. This social friction illuminated another layer of the control system. Not only did institutions depend on individuals' identity-based fears, but most personal relationships were structured around mutual manipulation through those same fears. People had learned to manage each other through the strategic application of approval, disapproval, guilt, obligation, and emotional manipulation. When one person became immune to these tactics, the entire dynamic required renegotiation. Marcus found himself in the strange position of having to teach people how to relate to him without the familiar tools of psychological leverage. Some adapted quickly, discovering that direct communication and mutual respect were actually more satisfying than the subtle games of control they had previously played. Others found the change too threatening and gradually distanced themselves, unable to function in a relationship where their primary tools of influence had become ineffective. The process revealed how thoroughly society was organized around the principle of mutual fear-based control. Political systems depended on citizens who could be motivated by threats and promises. Economic systems required consumers who felt inadequate without constant acquisition, and workers who feared economic insecurity more than meaningful fulfillment. Social systems functioned through networks of obligation, expectation, and mutual surveillance that kept everyone monitoring and modifying their behavior to maintain their position. Breaking free from identity-based control didn't mean becoming antisocial or irresponsible. Instead, it meant engaging with social structures from a position of choice rather than compulsion. Marcus could fulfill his professional obligations without needing external validation of his worth. He could maintain relationships without requiring constant reassurance or giving others power over his emotional state. He could participate in community life without sacrificing his autonomy to groupthink or social pressure. The key insight was that authentic strength came not from building stronger defenses around his various identities, but from recognizing that his true self transcended any particular identity entirely. The weak self that others could manipulate was the collection of personas he had constructed to navigate social situations. The strong self that remained invulnerable was the awareness that could adopt any persona as needed without being trapped by it. This realization led to a profound shift in how he approached personal development and self-improvement. Instead of trying to build a better, more impressive identity, he focused on dismantling the psychological mechanisms that made any identity feel necessary for his well-being. Instead of accumulating more achievements, possessions, or relationships to feel secure, he questioned why he had believed external acquisition could provide internal satisfaction. The process was often uncomfortable, as it required letting go of attachments that had seemed essential to his happiness and security. But each release brought greater freedom and resilience. Like a tree shedding leaves before winter, the temporary loss of familiar supports revealed the stronger structure underneath that could weather any season. Part 3. The Indestructible Self. The final transformation occurs when one recognizes that the fears which make control possible are themselves illusions generated by a fundamental misunderstanding of what we actually are. The indestructible self emerges not through building stronger defenses, but through the recognition that there was never anything that could truly be destroyed in the first place. Marcus's journey led him to this ultimate paradox. The more completely he dismantled his attachments to temporal conditions, his job, his reputation, his possessions, even his relationships, the more powerful and effective he became within those very conditions. Free from the need to protect what couldn't actually be threatened, he could engage fully with life without the constant background anxiety that had previously constrained his choices and clouded his perception. This wasn't a philosophical concept, but a lived reality that manifested in every aspect of his daily experience. Conversations became opportunities for genuine exchange rather than strategic positioning. Professional challenges became creative puzzles rather than threats to his security. Even criticism and conflict became valuable information rather than personal attacks requiring defensive responses. The shift revealed something remarkable about the nature of fear itself. Every fear he had ever experienced was ultimately based on the assumption that some condition necessary for his well-being could be taken away. Fear of death was fear of losing his body. Fear of rejection was fear of losing social connection. Fear of failure was fear of losing his self-image. Fear of poverty was fear of losing material comfort. But as he examined each fear carefully, he discovered that his actual well-being had never depended on any of these conditions as absolutely as he had believed. This wasn't denial or spiritual bypassing. He wasn't pretending that practical consequences didn't matter. Loss of employment would still require finding new income. Physical injury would still involve pain and limitation. Social rejection would still be emotionally uncomfortable. But these challenges would be exactly what they were, nothing more and nothing less, without the additional layer of existential terror that had previously amplified their significance. The distinction was crucial. Pain was inevitable, but suffering was optional. Practical challenges were unavoidable, but psychological devastation was a choice. External events could affect his circumstances, but they couldn't touch his essential well-being unless he mistakenly identified that well-being with particular conditions that were always temporary and changeable. This recognition led to what might be called the Great Reversal. Instead of viewing himself as a vulnerable entity that needed protection from a threatening world, he began to experience himself as an aware presence that was inherently invulnerable and could therefore engage fearlessly with whatever challenges arose. The shift wasn't just psychological, but seemed to operate at a fundamental level of identity and perception. From this new vantage point, he could observe the elaborate systems of control that surrounded him with something approaching compassion rather than resentment. The managers, politicians, advertisers, and various other manipulators were themselves trapped within the same illusion of vulnerability that had once controlled him. Their attempts to control others were desperate efforts to create security in a reality they experienced as fundamentally threatening. Understanding this, Marcus found that he could interact with control-based systems without triggering defensive reactions in their operators. Since he wasn't trying to threaten their illusion of control, they didn't need to increase their efforts to control him. He could simply remain unaffected by their psychological tactics while continuing to fulfill whatever practical requirements the situation actually demanded. This approach proved far more effective than rebellion or confrontation. When someone attempted to manipulate him through fear, guilt, or obligation, he could acknowledge their concern without accepting their framing of the situation. He could provide reassurance about their actual needs without submitting to their psychological demands. He could maintain boundaries without creating conflict. The transformation became evident in how others responded to him. People who were accustomed to using fear-based tactics often found themselves disarmed by his calm refusal to accept their premise that he should be afraid. Initially, this might escalate their efforts as they unconsciously sensed that their usual tools weren't working, but eventually most would either adapt to more direct and honest forms of communication or simply avoid him when they wanted to use manipulative tactics. More interesting were the people who began to feel safer in his presence. There was something about his lack of fear-based reactivity that created space for others to relax their own defensive postures. Conversations became more honest, relationships became more authentic, and collaborative efforts became more effective when at least one participant wasn't operating from a position of chronic psychological protection. Marcus realized he had become what might be called a non-reactive presence. Someone who could remain centered and responsive regardless of the emotional or psychological pressure others might bring to interactions. This wasn't emotional numbness or detachment, but rather a profound stability that allowed for deeper engagement with life rather than less. The practical benefits were undeniable. Professional decisions became clearer when not clouded by career anxiety. Financial choices became more rational when not driven by status concerns or security fears. Relationship dynamics improved when not distorted by neediness or the fear of abandonment. Creative expression flourished when freed from the fear of judgment or failure. But the most profound change was in his relationship to uncertainty itself. What had once been the source of his deepest anxieties, the unpredictable nature of existence, became a source of fascination and opportunity. Without predetermined attachment to specific outcomes, every moment contained unlimited potential. Without the need to control circumstances, he could respond spontaneously and creatively to whatever emerged. This didn't mean becoming passive or indifferent to outcomes. He still made plans, set goals, and worked diligently toward objectives that seemed valuable. But his engagement with these activities was motivated by interest and appreciation, rather than fear and compulsion. Success became enjoyable rather than necessary, and failure became informative rather than devastating. The ultimate insight was that the indestructible self had always been present. It was simply the awareness that could observe all the various fears, desires, identities, and circumstances that had previously seemed so important. This awareness was never actually threatened by any external event because it wasn't dependent on any external condition for its existence or well-being. Recognizing this, the whole drama of control and resistance revealed itself as a kind of collective hallucination. People were desperately trying to protect something that couldn't actually be harmed, using methods that created the very suffering they were trying to avoid. The systems of fear-based control persisted only because most people hadn't yet discovered that they were already free and had always been invulnerable in the only way that ultimately mattered. The irony was complete. By destroying his weak self, the collection of attachments, identities, and fears that had made him controllable, Marcus had uncovered his true self, which was indestructible not because it was protected from harm, but because it was never the kind of thing that could be harmed in the first place. This realization didn't make him invulnerable to physical consequences or immune to emotional responses. He could still be injured, disappointed, or saddened by events. But these experiences would flow through him without creating lasting disturbance, like weather passing through the sky. The sky remained unchanged regardless of what patterns of wind, rain, or storm might temporarily occupy it. Living from this understanding transformed everything while changing nothing. His external life might appear similar to observers, but his internal experience had been revolutionized. He moved through the same world that had once seemed threatening and constraining, but now experienced it as a field of infinite possibility, where every challenge was an opportunity for creative response, and every interaction was a chance for authentic connection. The systems of control continued to operate around him, but they were like nets cast in empty space. There was simply nothing in him for them to catch. He had become truly free not by escaping from the world, but by discovering that he had never actually been trapped in it. Prison had been built of beliefs about what he needed to be safe and happy, and the key had always been the recognition that his true nature required neither safety nor happiness to be complete. In destroying his weak self, Marcus had not lost anything real. Instead, he had gained everything that mattered: the freedom to respond to life from a place of strength rather than fear, the ability to love without possessiveness, the capacity to work without desperation, and the profound peace that comes from knowing that one's essential well-being can never be threatened by any external circumstance. This was the dark psychology of power and control turned inside out, not the power to control others through their fears, but the power that comes from being beyond the reach of such control oneself. It was the ultimate victory, won not through conquest but through the simple recognition of what had always been true, that the one who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because what remains is indestructible by its very nature. The transformation was complete, yet it was also just the beginning. Having discovered his own invulnerability, Marcus found himself naturally drawn to help others recognize theirs, not through teaching or preaching, but simply through being an example of what was possible. When someone refused to participate in the collective delusion that external conditions could determine internal well-being. In a world organized around mutual fear and control, the presence of even one person who had transcended these dynamics created ripples of possibility that extended far beyond what might be immediately visible. Like a stone dropped into still water, the impact of authentic freedom could spread in ways that might eventually reach the furthest shores of human consciousness. The weak self, once destroyed, could never be reconstructed in the same way. What emerged from its dissolution was not a new and improved persona, but the recognition of what had always been present beneath all personas, the indestructible awareness that was both the ultimate refuge and the ultimate freedom. The journey from fear-based existence to authentic freedom is not a destination but a recognition. Those who undertake it discover that they were never actually imprisoned, except by beliefs about what imprisonment meant. In destroying the weak self that accepts such beliefs, one doesn't become strong. One discovers the strength that was always present, waiting to be uncovered beneath the layers of conditioning that had obscured it from view. This is why fear works so effectively as a tool of control, and why its transcendence represents the ultimate liberation. The systems that govern through fear depend entirely on people who believe they are vulnerable in ways they are not, and who seek security through means that can never provide it. When these beliefs are questioned and dissolved, the entire architecture of control collapses, not through force or rebellion, but through the simple absence of what it required to maintain its influence. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because he has discovered what in him was always beyond destruction. This is not philosophy, but practical psychology. Not theory, but lived reality. Not escape from the world, but the ultimate engagement with it from a position of unassailable strength.